All right. So yeah, I think we can start now. All right. So as participants join in, we can keep adding people. But yeah, meanwhile you can share your screen and can join you. Yeah, we can see your screen. So yeah, give me a minute to introduce you. So good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for joining for today's afternoon webinar for the British Society for Geomorphology Postgraduate Forum. I'm Joyce, presently the chair of the forum, and we are happy to welcome Dr. Rosie Huck. She is presently based at the University of Oxford as a Hume Junior Research Fellow, basically working on desert biogeomorphology, and she completed her undergraduate from Arizona State in US, moving on to Sheffield for her master's in polar and alpine change. And then she continued her PhD in Oxford, basically based on what she's presenting today, is partially vegetated dune landscapes affected by fire and dust emissions related to that. Um, after that, she went to University of Southampton for a few months as a lecturer in climate and environmental change. And apart from all this, she has a interesting profile. She's a student athlete, and she has been representing Great Britain in water polo. So that's also another interesting part of her. Yeah, that's it. And yeah, thank you, Rosie, for agreeing for this webinar. Please take it over from here. Thank you.
Thanks for the lovely introduction, Jayesh. So hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rosie Huck. Like Jayesh said, I am a junior research fellow at the University of Oxford, having completed my PhD last year. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD work, which is looking at dust emission potential from burn surfaces on vegetated dune fields in the southwest Kalahari. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our findings, but then also the methods and using a holistic approach spanning the field of biogeomorphology to answer complex geomorphological questions. So I know a lot of you who are listening today research dust, but for those of you who don't know, dust is particles of the soil. Ooh, have I been stopped sharing?
Yeah, I think you can reshare your screen again.
Yeah. You see that?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks.
So particles of dust are parts of the soil which are lofted into the atmosphere, which are then transported, sometimes thousands of kilometers in the atmosphere and deposited elsewhere. On this slide, I have a picture of Africa on a given day, and we can see that there are four distinct dust events, at least four distinct dust events occurring here. And I think this image really shows how dust can have transcontinental implications, and that it comes in many different shapes and sizes. We have a big dust storm coming off the Sahara, and then we have a little one coming off of West Africa. So there's lots of different impacts of dust, and they can be categorized into three sort of different categories, which come from the stage in the dust cycle where they come from. So initially we have the emission stage, and when dust is emitted, it strips the soil where it comes from of important nutrients, and that can lead to problems in agriculture. Also, where it's emitted, we might have very dense dust clouds, which can cause transportation hazards. I've got a picture of a dust storm in Phoenix, Arizona on the side, and then also that can cause problems for human health. I guess the transportation hazards and the human health hazards fall into the second category as well, which is when dust is in transport. So once dust is lofted up into the atmosphere, It can affect the atmospheric chemistry, but it can also impact cloud formation. So it's a condensation nuclei, and that can impact where clouds form and therefore precipitation patterns as well. Because we're changing where clouds form, we can also impact the albedo of the Earth and heating and cooling. And so that's why dust is important when it's been transported. It's also really important where it's deposited. So dust can be a really important source of nutrients for both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. The classic example of that is the Amazon rainforest being fertilized by dust from the Sahara. And then also, if it's deposited on snow, that can impact the albedo of the snow and therefore snowmelt. So it's really important that we understand where dust is coming from and how much dust is in the atmosphere and where it's travelling to. So as a geomorphologist, I'm mainly interested in the first aspect of the dust cycle, which is the emission process. And so what landforms are emitting dust and what conditions lead to dust emissions. So there's many ways in which we can investigate this. I've sort of very crudely broken it down into 3 categories now. So the first one would be ground observations. So in that we go to a field site that we think is dusty or we know is dusty and set up some equipment to monitor aerosol concentrations and then importantly wind too, because you're not going to get dust movement unless you have the wind blowing quite strongly as well. So I've put a picture here on the slide of a field campaign led by Giles Wiggs a couple of years ago. And this is an instrumentation setup at a toshapan. And we can see a wind anemometer array and then also various ways of measuring dust emissions on the ground. We also have remote sensing. So ground observations are great, but they can be both temporally and spatially quite explicit. And the way that we can scale that up is by using remote sensing. So there are a wide variety of tools that we can use with remote sensing to establish which places are emitting dust and when they are emitting dust. So on the slide, I have a picture of Southern Africa on a day when it's very windy, and you can see dust coming off of the toshapan and then also coming from ephemeral lake valleys going over the Atlantic Ocean. We can then use our remote sensing data and our ground observations to help inform models. And that's really important to understand how dust and dust emission is going to change into the future, but then also it can help us recreate past climates, which is also really important. So, like I said, as a geomorphologist, I'm interested in the sort of landscapes that emit dust and what conditions lead to dust emissions. And so when we think of our typically dusty landscapes, we tend to think of topographic basins, particularly ones where fine sediment is sort of regularly renewed. So that tends to be sources where fluvially derived sediment is flooded in, deposited, and then is available to blow. So classic examples of this will be lake beds and ephemeral river valleys, where water brings in these sediments and then either the sediments are precipitated or deposited, and then when the water recedes, there's dust that's available to blow. And I've got some really good examples here. So a classic would be a toshapan in the north of Namibia, and then also we can see some dust blowing from the southwestern coastal ephemeral river valleys too. Let me share again. I don't know why this keeps happening. Okay. And then on the right of the screen here, we can also see an image of a snapshot of a really strong easterly wind that's coming across Namibia. So you can see a toshapan again. But what's interesting about this figure on the right is you can see dust plumes going over the top of the Namib sand sea, coming from ephemeral river valleys, but there's not actually that much dust coming from the sand dunes themselves. So that's interesting because sand dunes are not typically considered to be large sources of dust because they have larger grain sizes and these sort of fluvially derived dust sources. So they require more energy to be emitted into the atmosphere. So when we look at the most prolific dust sources around the world, we tend to see that they come from these basin topographic depression and fluvially derived sources. So if we look at this figure here, we can see that several of the top 11 sources come from ephemeral lakes like Etosha and the Sala, the Uni, Makgadikgadi Basin, where they have that supply of sediment. The Dobeli Depression in Chad is the most prolific dust source in the world, and that is a paleo lake source too. But if we look into the literature, we can actually see that many studies that have investigated dust have actually found that dust is coming from sand dunes, and it's not really talked about that much, but it is a global phenomenon. It's been mentioned in papers from all around the world, and they mention dune sources of dust from both bare sand dunes, so those are the sort of classic, really large sand dunes that you see when you think of like deserts, and then also from vegetated sand dunes as well. So I'm really interested in vegetated sand dunes, and when we look at a vegetated sand dune system like the one I have in the image here, we wouldn't really typically consider this to be a source of dust. And at the state it is in the picture, it's not going to be emitting dust, mainly because of all the vegetation that exists there. So we have a mosaic of grasses, trees, shrubs, biological soil crusts that all work together to prevent the large movement of sand within these systems. And therefore, most people consider vegetated dune fields to be like inactive or stabilised. I have a little issue with that, especially in the Kalahari context, because as you can see in the picture, there are these bare interspaces, particularly on the crest, and these are geomorphically active. So sediment is moving through the system there. So these systems I would consider to be periodically active or partially vegetated. So sediment is moving there. But we wouldn't really expect to see much dust emissions. The vegetation itself also traps dust, which is being evected across the dune field. So it traps it within its canopy and deposits it and traps it in its sediment. And then also, because we have a stabilisation, we have some weak pedogenesis happening and weathering where fine grains are building up. So when the dunes are in this stabilised state, we have these larger sand grains, but we also have this slow accumulation of finer resident sand grains that are building up. So we have this mosaic of biological soil crust, bare interspace, vegetation, and it all exists in this fine biogeomorphic balance where if there's any disturbance to the system can change its state. And so we're thinking about framing vegetated sand dunes in the context of dust emissions. The state that we normally find them in when they're vegetated would be a sink. So we have this really slow accumulation of dust and it's trapping some sediments too. And so the dust is being deposited there. If we have any sort of disturbance events that occurs, whether that be fire, drought, grazing, then the vegetation is removed, and that can switch the system from a sink of dust to a source of dust. And all of those resident fines, which have accumulated over a long period of time, can be released in the form of a dust storm. And so this is the theory, and it's been talked about in the literature a little bit. And Mark Sweeney in 2023 and authors came up with this diagram, which sort of explains how this process works. So initially, when the dunes are devegetated, we have this big peak in dust emissions, which is where those resident fine grains are initially rapidly eroded by the wind. But this level of dust emission can't be sustained for a long period of time because we have that supply limitation. So there's not this recharge of fine sediments that happen very quickly. So then we have this decrease in emission. And on that, it depends then if the reactivation is permanent or if the reactivation is temporary. So if the reactivation is temporary and the dunes revegetate, it will sink back and become, again, a sink of dust rather than a source. But if the reactivation is permanent, we'll see dust being produced by aeolian abrasion and this low-level, more diffuse dust emissions occurring then on. And so this is the theory, and a good way to test that will be looking for events that trigger rapid devegetation of a surface. And one way in which that happens is through fire. So on the slide here, on the main panel, I have pulled out burnt area on aeolian deposits around the globe. And so we can see that actually fires occur on sandy soils in lots of locations around the world in duney areas. Ooh. Don't know why it keeps on doing this, sorry. Yes, so duney areas around the world. And then in the individual panels, I've pulled out a study by Yu and Janu in 2022, which looked at increases in dust optical depth over fire scars. And then I've cropped it to areas where there are aeolian deposits. So we can see there are increases in dust optical depth over fire scars in the immediate post-fire period. And so we can argue that this shows that post-fire vegetation disturbance can switch vegetated dune fields from a sink to a source of dust. But it's not really been observed, or there hasn't been that many observations in the field of dust emissions occurring on dune environments post-fire. And so the sort of aim of my PhD was to use an integrated approach to investigate if the Kalahari dunes emit dust after a disturbance by burning. And that can be broken down into three quite simple questions. So what is the magnitude of fire in the region? What is the potential for dust emission? And are there any post-fire erodibility controls other than vegetation? And so to do that, we have to take an integrated approach. We can use remote sensing to look at a larger temporal scale and then also a larger spatial scale than we can do in the field. So we can use remote sensing to investigate long-term trends in fire and dust behaviour in the southwest Kalahari. But we need to supplement that and actually figure out what's happening on the ground with targeted field work. And because this work, fire, is inherently ecological, this work sort of spans two boundaries. It's definitely in the realm of biogeomorphology. And so we have integrated aspects of ecological and geomorphological monitoring into the framework of the PhD as well. So a little bit of context about the Kalahari. At the moment, it's warming at twice the global rate, and it's predicted to dry out into the future. And this predicted climate change has led to some research into whether the southwest Kalahari is going to reactivate. And different people have different opinions about this, but it has led to some research investigating if the dunes were to become devegetated, if they were to become a dust source. And so there is a theory that this might be the case. I want to emphasize that I'm not studying the entirety of the Kalahari. It's the largest sand sea in the earth. I'm interested explicitly in the southwest Kalahari portion where there are linear dunes. This is also the most arid area and probably the most vulnerable to future climate change. Talking about aridity, the area is classed as arid now, and it has an annual precipitation of around 250 millimetres per year. That's extremely variable. Interannually, precipitation can vary, I think, by around 50%. And I've got some pictures here of the different cumulative precipitation for each year of my study, and you can see that it varies drastically. A good example is 2022 and 2023, where 2022 was a wet year and then 2023 was a drought. And I definitely observe that during my field work. Okay. So question one, which is what is the magnitude of fire in the region? We wanted to find this out because we need to understand the proportion of the dune field that is devegetated by fire and whether that is large enough, significant, and how frequently that happens. To do that, this is mainly a remote sensing project because we need large spatial scales and large temporal scales to understand that. So we did this using three main methods. Using the MODIS burnt area product to understand and create an inventory of fire, so when fire occurs and what triggers fire. And then how long the surface is devegetated for. We looked into using different vegetation indices to understand that. And then we also used some burn indices to understand the severity of the burning too. So an important caveat before I get into the inventory of fire is that this region is quite often overlooked in burnt area studies. So these are three quite prominent works where burnt area is calculated, and it gives this impression that this region doesn't burn. There are many reasons for that. It's not intentional. It's just gives this vision to lots of other people that this area is fire-free, when that's not the case, because I've been there and I've seen the fires and I've spoken to local landowners who talk about fire on their land. So there's lots of issues and these products are continuously developing. But I did fall down a rabbit hole at the start of my PhD trying to figure out, how well these different products actually detect fire, and to come up with some ideas as to why that was the case. I digitized fire scars in certain areas and then used the MODIS product, which is the NASA burnt area product, and then the Fire CCI, which is the European Space Agency's product, and found that they actually have pretty poor overlap with my digitized burnt area. So the highest was 44% detection, and the fire and the lowest was 7%. So they're really struggling to pick up burning areas on the dunes. That was a rabbit hole I could have spent my whole PhD trying to figure out. So I had to eventually decide to just use the MODIS burnt area because it was the best. But it's important to caveat the next work with saying, you know, there are some significant advances that will need to be made with this product for this region. So what we found was that the magnitude of fire in the region is large. Let's see if this works. Yeah, a significant amount of the area burns over the time period, 16,000 square kilometres in total, and 13,000 of that, which was individual land, so 3,000 kilometres of that reburnt over the 24-year time period. This was in 240 individual fire events. What's really interesting is that 66% of the land that burnt in the Kalahari Transfrontier National Park, which you can see is highlighted in green on the side. And this area experiences much denser burning than the rest of the region. And I'll get into that in a little bit. If we think about the sort of annual seasonality of fire and where fire occurs, fire is linked to La Nina periods. It occurs most frequently during or just after a La Nina period. And that's because La Nina in Southern Africa brings in a lot of precipitation. The fires in the region are limited by precipitation because you need rain for the vegetation to grow. And so when you have a wet season, you'll typically see lots of fires in the following dry season. If it's too dry and there's not that much vegetation, we're not going to be experiencing fires in the regions, which is what happens during El Nino months. If we then look at the monthly patterns, we can see that fires occur in a very distinct period. They occur mostly in the spring and maybe in early January too. But when we break that down into patterns that occur in a national park and patterns that occur in the mostly private farmland, there are distinct differences. So the private farmland experiences small but frequent fires, whereas the national park experiences large but infrequent fires. The national park has a very distinct burn period in the spring and in September, whereas the private farmland experiences burning a little bit more frequently throughout the year. And that's because the national park has a policy where they let all naturally ignited fires burn to their fullest extent. And so that might be a representation of a more like natural fire regime in the area. So then we know the fires burn and we're assuming they remove vegetation, but how long is that vegetation removed for? So how long is that window of opportunity for dust emission after fire? And to do that, we used remote sensing and vegetation indices to assess how long it takes fire burn scars to recover. We used the soil adjusted total vegetation index to do this, primarily because SAPV incorporates both photosynthesizing and senescent vegetation as well, because it uses the shortwave infrared bands. And that's been shown in some studies to have a better representation of surface cover in desert environments. So what we did was we had control plots which were unburnt, close by burnt plots, and then we could compare the two and see how long it takes fires to return to the control levels. And so what we can see here is that it takes around 2 years to return to control. But control doesn't represent the period in which vegetation, dust emission can occur. In the Kalahari, it was previously shown that above 14% vegetation cover, there is a big reduction in aeolian transport. So vegetation below 14% cover is the window in which dust emission theoretically could occur. And we showed that this period below 14% is actually 112 days using total vegetation fractional cover. So around 4-ish months after fire, we have this period where dust can be emitted. On a side note, when we just looked at the SAPV, control SAPV levels, we also see that drought links to vegetation reduction for around 112 days as well. So on a temporal scale, burning and drought are on a similar level, but obviously drought covers a much larger spatial scale than burning. We also looked at some burn severity. So this is also another comment on how well these products work in desert environments. They're more designed for temperate regions, but we can see that there's a variety of results. There's some fires which show enhanced regrowth within 1 month of burning, which probably isn't correct, but there's other fires that show severe and high severity burning. And so the overall pattern in this trend is depending on the year that it burnt. So whether the fires occurred during a drought or after a drought, that's really important in terms of the burn severity and how these indices work. But in general, quite a lot of them are considered to be low severity fires, so the vegetation recovers quickly. Okay, so now we know there's fire in the region. It occurs, quite often after La Nina events, and now we need to go into the field and see, actually what's happening, and is there this potential in the field for dust emission to occur. So we did a targeted field campaign where we chose 12 fire scars over the whole of the Southwest Kalahari, so in Namibia and in South Africa, which had a variety of times since they burnt. So the youngest fire scar that we went to burnt 3 days previously, and the oldest fire scar burned around 10 years previously. So there was this wide variety of time since fire. I was also interested in the different topographies of the dune. We conducted measurements on the crests, the interdunes, and the flanks to see how these affected the dust potential. And then each sort of fire scar site had a burnt plot and a control plot, so we can compare the two. These were as close as possible. So I've got an example on the slide here where they were along the same crest, but they also could have been a couple of dunes apart just due to logistical reasons. So the way we interrogated this in the field was to collect sediment samples, lots of sediment samples between the burnt and the control plots, and then also use a portable wind tunnel to investigate if there is this potential for dust emission to occur. So when we look at the sediment distributions, we can see that the Kalahari does have this proportion of resident fine grains that I was talking about earlier. When we compare that to an active sand dune, the Namib sand sea, for example, we can see there is a larger variance in grain size, and there is that fine part represented. However, the sand grains, they are still pretty big. On average, they were 249 microns. And the sediment texture chart, you can see most of them sit in sand. But there was this component of fine material up to 30% in the interdunes. When we look at the different dune topographies, we can see that there is a difference between the amount of fines in the crest, flank, and interdunes. So the interdunes have the highest proportion and the crests have the lowest proportion. That makes sense. The crests in the Kalahari are rarely vegetated or sporadically vegetated. And so they're moving, and we would expect the dust not really to be retained in the sediment there. Whereas in the interdunes, where there's lots of vegetation, they're locked in. Most importantly, what we found was that there's no significant difference between the paired sites between the burnt and the unburnt dunes. We were expecting, if there is dust emissions, for there to be a coarsening from the control to the burnt plots. And that's because if the dust was being eroded after fire, that resident fine material would preferentially be removed. And so we would expect to see larger grain sizes in the burnt plots than in the control plots, and we didn't find that. So that could be an indication that dust isn't being removed from the sites. Next, we know we have this resonant fine material, so there is this potential for sediment to be mobilised. We wanted to use a set of controlled experiments to understand if this sediment can be mobilised. The way we did that is using the PySwirl. So this is a portable wind tunnel. It's made possible through the lovely buggy that you can see on the screen. Doesn't mean it's easy to push up and down a sand dune. But basically how we do this is we place it on the surface. And inside the test chamber, there's a flat blade. We can set that to go at a known rate, and then from that we can infer the shear stress that's being exerted on the surface. And then the dust tract measures the amount of dust in the chamber. And so from that we can figure out thresholds for erosion, but also fluxes of dust at certain shear velocities. So at each site, we repeated this by just placing it on the surface up to 5 times. And then we also did a scrape test where we mechanically removed, scraping away the top 2 centimeters of the surface, and saw if that made any impact, and did repeat experiments on that too. And that's what's shown in the picture on the slide. So I only did a ramp test, so we just increased the speed of the blade slowly to get the threshold, and then kept it at a high shear stress for a while, and then shear velocity for a while, and then dropped it down to understand any sort of controls on emission. So what we found there was that overall there's a low potential to emit dust. So apart from the first site, which we revisited twice, there was not much difference between the burnt and the control plots, and these PM10 measurements are also pretty low. What we did find, interestingly, was that there was a significantly higher threshold for erosion on burnt surfaces, which is counter to what a lot of research says, that there would be this higher threshold. So we're not too sure of why that is. There could be lots of reasons, from some sort of sediment sorting, baking of the sediments when they're heated, or biological soil crust involvement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. And then again, we found no significant difference between emission flux potential between the burnt and the control plots. However, we did find much larger fluxes of dust on those scraped and mechanically disturbed plots compared to just the fire and the control plots. And so once we remove those top 2 centimeters of the surface, there is a much larger potential. So that tells us something there is trapping and ensnaring those grains and limiting emissions, but that only occurs in the top few centimeters of the sediment. Okay, and so then we also looked into the potential of when we need to think about potential of dust, we also have to consider wind. So is the wind strong enough for dust to blow? And this strong wind needs to line up with the period when there's vegetation has been removed. To do that, we put up a meteorological tower with anemometers on, and then also aerosol concentration measurements through a dust tract. And so what we found was we were only able to do this for a month, and we put it at sites immediately after the fire. So both sites had burnt recently where we measured this. And we need to set this in the context of the broader wind story in the Kalahari. So September 2022, when we did this, was a higher than average windy September. It's not the windiest month of the year, but September also when the fires happen. So we can think it's pretty representative. And what we found was that the wind speeds were generally pretty low. There weren't that many events when the wind got pretty high and higher than typical thresholds to emit dust. So when we plot the dust tracks, so the aerosol concentrations with the wind speed increases, there's a poor relationship between the aerosol concentrations and the wind speed. But there were 4 events when PM10 and wind speed increased at the same time. So that could be indicative of localized dust emissions. However, there were also 4 events when wind speeds increased without aerosol increase. And so this relationship isn't always, it breaks down frequently. So if we were to investigate those 4 events when there was concurrent increase in wind speed and dust emissions, we can see that the aerosol concentrations are actually pretty low. So none of the aerosols concentrations reached a threshold that have previously been defined as dusty in other research. And the wind speeds were also relatively low for these events too. We also can't be certain that these increases in aerosols were actually dust. They could be local dust. They could be dust that's vectored across the dune field from further afield, or they could be the local emission or remobilized burnt debris in the area. And so without images and capturing that, we wouldn't really be able to tell the difference there. So we can see that there is this potential for dust. We've got some PySol measurements that show that if we disturb the surface, there could be dust emissions. We know there's fine sediments in the soil, but we haven't observed any dust remote sensing wise, or with any definitive dust, or with our aerosol concentration in situ. So that's telling us that there might be some erodibility controls. And so to do that, we had to put our ecological hats on and do some surveys to understand, what could be some other factors that are preventing dust emissions here. So to do that, we did some transect surveys of vegetation and surface cover, and then we also investigated biological soil crust cover. So biocrusts, I've mentioned them a few times. For those of you who don't know, they're these communities of bacteria and algae that exist in the top few millimeters of the soil, and they secrete these glue-like substances that bind the grains together and create this cohesive layer on top of the surface. And that provides extra protection against sand moving as well, because the grains are ensnared together. And so I've pulled out a picture here where you can see that protective layer that biological soil crusts are creating on the surface there. So what we found in our ecological surveys was that in the initial post-fire periods, the surface is actually covered in burnt debris. So the wind is not going to be able to get to the surface, and so we're not really going to be able to see any mineral dust emissions occurring immediately after fire, because this debris is covering up to a high percentage. This lasts for around 2 months, and during that time, the burnt debris is eroded away, most likely by the wind, because it didn't rain during this period, and we observed a reduction in the cover. And so this is really important because a lot of remote sensing studies that investigate post-fire dust emissions actually only investigate 2 to 3 months after fire. And we showed it in the Kalahari, you're not going to be getting dust emissions until after 2 months, and maybe only for a couple of months after that. So that's actually really important in targeting when we need to assess for dust emissions in the region. It also helps explain some of our dust tract measurements. So our in situ aerosol measurements were taken during this time when there was high surface cover. And so the increases in aerosol we saw with the increases in wind speed, it is likely, or it could be likely, that there is this is just a remobilization of local burnt debris. This is quite easy to track using remote sensing. So you can look at the surface albedo and identify when this burnt debris is washed away. So that can be a month or longer, or 2 months after the fire. And so depending on the sort of conditions at the time, it will vary. And so you can see that's being tracked here. When we then, after that burnt debris is blown away, the duration in which the period in which dust can be emitted is then linked obviously to vegetation regrowth, and so that links to larger climate cycles. So the first year when we went back, we found the vegetation regrew very quickly, and in the second year when we went back in the drought, we saw that there was a massive reduction in vegetation cover. Interestingly enough, all of the burnt sites, regardless of how long it had been since they burned, were less resilient to drought than the unburnt surfaces. So all the burned surfaces reduced to under 25% surface cover during the drought period, whereas the control sites, most of them remained above that, above 25% too. There's the changes of the effect of fire is long-lasting on the vegetation in the region. We also found biological soil crusts at 95% of the interdune plots. We found them at 100% of the burnt interdune plots. And so that tells us that biocrusts are surviving the fire themselves. And that means they're offering that protection to the surface in that period when vegetation is reduced. These are really hard to identify from just looking at the soil. You have to dig these trenches to be able to see the biocrust. And we also really struggle to detect this from space. And so the biocrust might be the key as to why we're not seeing dust emissions occurring from the Kalahari. They survive the fire and they can afford that protective effect for that period when the vegetation cover is low. So overall, we found little evidence for fire leading to the emission of dust in the Kalahari. And we found this by using an integrated approach. We were able to identify how important fire is to potentially lead to dust emissions using remote sensing. And then we were able to go into the field and sort of unlock some questions that we had about that. So using an integrated approach was really important in this study. So I'm not arguing, however, that the Kalahari cannot emit dust. I'm just arguing that there's little evidence that fire induces that link to dust emission. So as part of my project, I did do an inventory of dust being emitted from the Kalahari. And what we found was that there are some plumes originating from within the dune field. You can see here that they're in quite faint pink, but there are some plumes that are originating here. This was in 2024. So 2024 was another drought year. And it had been a few years of drought, and it's likely that the biological soil crusts at this stage were unable to survive these conditions and started to degrade. And then maybe that's when we're seeing this shot of those resident fine grains being emitted. You can see this in satellite imagery. There's definitely is the potential for dust, but it just might not be linked to fire. And so what's cool about this is that we can then link it to the figure that I showed you at the start of the presentation, where I can add in my own data. So if we take fires reactivation occurring at 0, what we can see is that initially in that post-fire period, there's no dust emissions because of the burnt debris. Then we'll have some dust emissions occurring, but these are much lower than the ones that Sweeney observed elsewhere. And so there's this low threshold of emission, which is the resident fine grains being emitted, those that aren't trapped by the biological soil crust. In the solid red line, this would be in a wet year, so those emissions are low and they're quite quick, and then it would revegetate and we'd go back to being a sink of dust again. If the reactivation co-occurred with a drought, we may see some higher emissions as the biological soil crusts begin to degrade, and that will last for a longer period of time. And then we'll see that reduction back to abrasion-based erosion occurring over a longer timescale if that devegetation is a persistent effect. And so we get this nice little circle of events that are occurring in the Kalahari, which is very simplified. But what it shows is that at present, if it's vegetated, the vegetation and biocrust protect the surface from the wind erosion and trap those fine grains. The fire comes along, destroys the protected vegetation cover, but those biological soil crusts survive the fire and protects the surface during the low surface vegetation cover period. And so then vegetation can regrow and we get this loop continuing. However, if fire occurs during and a fire occurs and then there's a drought afterwards, we may see some aeolian abrasion and the breakdown and degradation of biological soil crusts, or grazing can also break down crusts, and then we'll see those resident fines being emitted, and then maybe that can lead to a permanent state change in the system. That's what it's like at the moment. We're not too sure what's going to happen into the future. So under future conditions, the Kalahari, there's lots of things we're unsure of. So it's going to get hotter and drier. And so that will change vegetation patterns and what sort of vegetation we're having there. And so that will lead to a change in the fire regime. So we're not too sure, there's no consensus in the research, what the future of fire is going to look like in the region, mainly because it's been underestimated as occurring at the moment. And then linking that back into biocrusts, we're not sure how biocrusts are going to react to the drying climate, whether other species will take over or whether we'll start seeing a reduction in their cover. And then tied into all of that is this slow sediment recharge. We're not getting pulses of sediment being washed into the Kalahari. And so it's likely that if there is dust emissions, it's going to be a big pulse of sediment in a storm, and then we'll get low abrasion produced dust as a result. So lots of questions and future research to look at in the Kalahari. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to say a massive thank you to the landowners who let me work on their land. It was amazing working with them and talking to them. And a big thanks to the Kalahari Transfrontier National Park for letting me conduct some research there. And then also to my colleagues who went out in the field and helped me research too. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. That's it's a very nice presentation, quite insightful. Yeah, a lot of dust going around in this part of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Please unmute yourself if you have any questions, queries for Rosie, and you can go ahead, or you can type it in the chat box. I can read that out.
Shall I break the awkward silence, Jayesh?
Yes, please go ahead.
That was a nice talk. So the key to protecting land surfaces there is looking after the biological soil crusts, it seems. There's obviously difference between the community composition of soil crusts beneath shrubs and grasses, as a number of studies have shown.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some kind of feedback, I would imagine, between where fires occur, on what type of vegetation, the intensity of the burns, the frequency of the burns,
Yeah.
and the ability for BSCs to survive or not. So I don't know whether you can offer any additional thoughts on that. I know that wasn't your primary focus, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. This was definitely something I thought about a lot. So and it's talked about in the publications that I wrote about. So where I did my measurements, they were mainly in the grassy areas. They weren't under the shrubs. And we made that decision purposely because when the shrubs burnt, they didn't burn completely, and so they're still adding a lot of roughness to the area in the shrub patches. And so because of that roughness, we didn't suspect those areas would be emissive of dust. For those of you who don't know, biocrusts are found preferentially under shrubs because they provide protection from grazing animals. But all of our measurements were taken in the grassy areas. So the grassy areas, we still found biological soil crust presence. They were mainly type 1 biocrusts, which basically means they're they're really hard to identify from above, and they're quite loosely consolidated, but they're definitely still there, so they're still affording some sort of protection. So saying that, and the link back into fire, is that the shrubs will burn the hottest because they have the most flammable material, and the grassy areas will burn cooler because there's just not as much combustible material there. And so there is a link back, is that the shrubs will burn the hottest, they're most likely to drop fatty acids and they can produce dust, but they're still got their skeleton there, so they are still adding a roughness effect, whereas the grassy areas will burn cooler, there's less fatty acids dropped onto the soil, which will mean maybe less increased cohesiveness there rather than decreased cohesiveness. And so there's this whole cycle. It is discussed quite a lot in my research, but I didn't really talk about it today. So it's a really, really good question and quite a complex loop. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, is there any more questions for Rosie? All right. If there's none, so yeah, I would love to understand like how does this biocrust which forms, and if there is a fire that burns and then it's gone, so how does it like increases aeolian transportation? So have you tried to track something like that, or?
Okay, so how does fire increase aeolian transport?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the primary effect I was talking about today is the removal of vegetation. So the vegetation protects the surface, and so suddenly all of this surface is available to be eroded by the wind, whereas previously it was protected by vegetation. There's also been a lot of studies that look into the changes in surface hydrophobicity as a result of vegetation burning. So when vegetation burns, it drops it actually volatilizes fatty acids that then go onto the soil and then condense around the grains, change their contact angles, and make them easier to be eroded by the wind because they're more they have less contact angles. And so there's that aspect too. So that's why fire can lead to, on two different reasons, lead to increases in dust emissions. And then how biological soil crusts play into that is that the biological soil crust binds the grains together already before the fire, and so through that cohesive effect that the crusts have, that's not being destroyed by the fire anymore, and so those the sort of changes in the soil hydrophobicity, they're not having an effect. because we checked in the grasses area, there's less soil hydrophobicity in grassy areas than there would be in shrubby areas. We did measure soil hydrophobicity when we're out there and conducted 50 measurements at each transect that we took, and all of them there was no evidence of soil hydrophobicity. So I didn't talk about that today because the measurements were 0. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. No worries. Thanks for the response. Yeah, Stephen, go ahead. You're ahead.
Yeah,
Hand is up.
just a follow-up question. Not knowing really much about this topic at all. When you talk about dust, are you talking about mineral dust?
Yeah.
And if so, how do you differentiate that, or rather, how do the remote sensing products differentiate that from soot?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the issues, but just the different size distributions of soot compared to dust, and their different reflectance bands, we can tell the difference between the two. That's the problem, is that when dust is being emitted during a fire, you can't differentiate it unless you have LiDAR, basically. So if there's fire during dust events, if there's dust events during fire, and the dust is being transported in smoke, we can't detect that. So that's why I'm only looking for dust emissions post fire. So it is quite a complicated field, and that dust could be emitted during the fire events. Yeah.
You could also get soot emitted during the post-fire event, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's the burnt debris I'm talking about too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
That local mobilisation of burnt debris is the soot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. If there's anything else, anyone wants to pitch in for a quick question or something?
I think we're good.
Okay. Yeah, I think, pretty much quite a good one. Yeah, thank you, Rosie, for joining us today. And yeah, we would see you sometime soon again. And yeah, good luck with your next forms of research. And yeah, have a nice Easter break, everyone.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.